In late 2019, the Rita Curran case was re-examined with an eye toward making use of modern DNA technology to progress the investigation. Lieutenant J.T. Trieb, at this time the Detective Bureau commander, wrote, quote, "I wanted to take a different approach with the assignment of unsolved murder cases than what was the norm. I created a plan to select a case and treat it like the crime had just been committed. The Rita Curran case was chosen as it was currently assigned to a detective in the Detective Bureau, Detective Corporal Thomas Chenette, and the case had a lot of physical evidence with which to work. Because of the case's age, we decided that our primary focus would be on the forensic evidence. There had been a lot of evidence collected during the initial investigation, and over the years, minimal testing had been conducted. With advancements in DNA testing and genealogy research, we felt there was a chance at finding the suspect in this case." End quote. To start with, the detectives went back to the case file and made a list of the names of men who had never been eliminated. As Trieb put it, they cast a wide net. Everyone was on the list unless they had been eliminated by DNA. Lieutenant Trieb felt strongly that the attack on Rita had not been carried out by a random stranger. As he put it in his report, quote, "The suspect would have had approximately 70 minutes to discover that Rita was home alone and then commit this crime and escape before Carrie and Paul returned home. It would make it highly unlikely that this crime was the result of a random chance encounter with the victim. It is most probable that the suspect lived in close proximity where he would have had knowledge of who was at home and when." End quote. Lieutenant Trieb was onto something, but it would take forensic genealogy to tell him what. Detective Chenette, who had been handling the case alone on top of his active caseload, told the Daily Beast of the 2019 push, quote, "The amount of evidence that has been collected over the years is immense, as this has been one of, if not the, most investigated cases in the history of the Burlington Police Department. We believe this case is absolutely still solvable, but time is of the essence. The reality is that evidence and memories degrade over time, so we decided to give our maximum effort now, as many of the witnesses and involved parties are still with us and can be contacted." End quote. Chenette was right to feel a sense of urgency. Beverly, Rita's roommate, had already passed on, no longer able to testify or identify someone should it be needed. Paul Robinson, who shared the apartment with Rita, Carrie, and Beverly, felt encouraged that the police were taking up the case once more. This from the Daily Beast, quote, "The horror of the summer of 1971 will haunt him for the rest of his life. I still get nightmares about that night," he said. "I hope they catch whoever did this or figure out what happened. But all I have to say is that whoever was responsible, this person was evil, pure evil." Paul willingly gave a DNA sample and was ruled out. In 2020, the investigators knew that the cigarette butt was their best evidence. In August of that year, they began contacting first responders who had been at Rita's apartment all those years ago. The purpose was to determine if those first responders had smoked cigarettes, and if so, to obtain DNA samples to ensure they weren't chasing an innocent man. They needed to be sure that cigarette butt equals killer DNA. Some of these first responders had passed away, so they contacted people biologically related directly to them. These included OG ambulance crew members David Bean and Stephen Olio, and officers Richard Garrow and Don LaRocque. Detective Chenette called Garrow, who said he was at the first on the scene, and agreed to give a DNA sample to the police in Florida where he lived at the time. Detective Chenette collected DNA from LaRocque's daughter and entered that into the evidence. Same for the others. The cigarette butt was none of theirs. This whole cold case review took a lot of resources, energy, and time. Soon, the 50th anniversary of the murder rolled around in the summer of 2021. By now, the Rita Curran case was the oldest case still being actively investigated by the Burlington Police Department. We don't know any more today, 50 years later, than we knew the day of the murder Mary Campbell lamented to mychamplainvalley.com. By this time, both of her and Rita's parents had passed away, not ever knowing who killed their oldest child. The remaining members of the Curran family gave a statement to the Burlington Free Press in honor of the 50th anniversary. It reads, quote, 50 years is a long time to grieve, a long time to hope. The 50-year mark confirms that a resolution in our lifetime to Rita's murder is not going to happen. As a family in our prayers, we will never give up our deepest hope. Rita's story has a home in our family legacy forever. We recognize that over time, memories fade, evidence ages, the perpetrator may be dead, interest in the story wanes. For 50 years, the Burlington PD has worked every lead they have ever received and have been very compassionate to our family. We know Rita's death did not happen in a vacuum. Somebody somewhere knows what happened that night on July 19, 1971, and they will take that information to their grave. May God have mercy on their soul." End quote. Well, as we will see, someone did have information, but that person did not take that information to her grave. She was still alive. What she knew still to be revealed. Once they had compiled the detailed review of the case file and compiled an exhaustive list of names of men therein, the list was divvied up among the investigators to try to systematically eliminate them one by one using DNA. Detective Chanette, as the lead investigator, was given the names that were considered the most promising, as in, they fit the investigator's theory of the crime, that Rita had been attacked by someone who knew that she was home alone. In July 2021, Detective Chanette interviewed a woman who was friends with the 4 female roommates on the second floor at 15 Brooks Avenue. She had called in and said that she had been at that second-floor apartment that very night, and at other times. She recalled meeting the residents of the third floor, a mixed-race couple, which was not common at the time. The woman, she said, was bubbly and sweet. The man was strong and tall with a strong jaw, the silent type. Detective Chanette knew that the residents in the third-floor apartment in July 1971 were William and Michelle DeRuse, both of whom had been canvassed 3 times by contemporary investigators. A little digging told him that William DeRuse was deceased, but he decided to track down Michelle and see if she had any insights on the crime. After he located a relative of Michelle's and contacted him, Michelle called him back on December 27, 2021, and they talked by phone. She was now living in Oregon, and she remembered Rita's case well. They talked about her and her deceased husband's life in Burlington and their marriage, but she had nothing to add as far as Rita's murder went. But Detective Chanette had to do his job and rule William DeRuse out. After doing some research on Ancestry, he was able to locate a half-nephew of DeRuse who was living in New Mexico. This man's father had been a half-brother of William DeRuse and a professor at a New Mexico university until his recent death. Chanette sent the nephew a letter on March 10, 2022. It said, "As discussed, your late uncle has been identified as a person of interest in the investigation solely because he lived in the same building as the victim at the time. Your DNA, Y strand, can aid in the investigation by potentially ruling out your uncle as a suspect, as the sample will be compared to evidence existing in the case." The nephew agreed to give samples, which were collected by detectives from the Dona Ana County Sheriff's Office in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and Detective Chanette received them and tagged them into evidence on April 29, 2022. But the samples weren't tested. They sat there. The BPD was inundated with active homicide cases, and testing the half-relative of a remote suspect in a 50-year-old case had to take a back seat. So now it was spring 2022. Lieutenant Trieb had seen a documentary on the work Parabon was doing to identify killers in very old cases, just like Rita's, and decided to pursue this avenue. The next step was examining whether they had sufficient DNA in the extract from the cigarette butt to create a SNP profile. They sent it to Arbor Biosciences, which successfully sequenced it. Then, in mid-2022, they sent the SNP profile to Parabon, which entered it into FTDNA and GEDmatch. Cece explained her genealogical analysis at the press conference that was held later. She said that in Rita's case, she was incredibly lucky. It took her just a few hours to identify a compelling suspect. In the databases, Cece found that DNA relatives 1 and 2 shared 588 and 461 centimorgans respectively with the suspect. Matches 3 to 5 were terrific supporting matches with 127, 70, and 70 centimorgans respectively. Matches 1 and 3 descended from most recent common ancestors John Orr and Susanna Davies, born in 1828 and 1832 respectively. So Cece knew that the suspect must descend from this couple as well. Matches 2, 4, and 5 descended from the union of John Wilney, born 1796, and Gerbrig and Della, born 1801. The suspect was also descended from this couple. So these most recent common ancestors represented the 2 branches of the suspect's family tree, and they triangulated in a union marriage between Lois Orr, the surname from the ancestral couple from which matches 1 and 3 were descended, and her husband William DeRuse, a surname from which matches 2, 4, and 5 were descended. Lois and William had one son, a child named William R. DeRuse, born in 1939. William had no siblings. His mother died right after his birth, so he was the only living person descended from this unique set of ancestors. He was a first cousin once removed of each of DNA relatives 1 and 2, 1 on his maternal side and 2 on his paternal side. As for DNA relatives 3, 4, and 5, he was second cousin once removed, third cousin, and fourth cousin, respectively, to them. So Cece started looking into this William R. DeRuse. He was not from Vermont, and none of the relatives she could see on his tree were from Vermont either. But a quick historical document search revealed that William R. DeRuse had gotten married on July 5th, 1971 in, drumroll, Burlington, Vermont. He had married a woman named Michelle DeRuse, and the documented address on the marriage record for the couple was 15 Brooks Avenue, the same building that Rita Curran lived in. On August 11, 2022, Cece notified the Burlington investigators of her hypothesis that the subject was highly likely to be William Richard DeRuse. She told me it took her 2 hours to identify him as a likely suspect. I imagine that the investigators almost fell off their chairs. Cece had given them a name in a 50-year-old cold case in just a few days, and it was a name they knew. Detective Chenette had just been investigating him as one of a large number of men mentioned in the Rita Curran case file. Think back to when I discussed the neighborhood canvass the BPD conducted after Rita's murder. The notes taken by Detective Winterbottom, Officer Garrow, and Vermont State Trooper LaHue all document interactions they had with the residents of the third-floor apartment at 15 Brooks Avenue, Rita's 2 floors up neighbors. They were William and Michelle DeRuse. Both had said they were home in bed and saw nothing on the night of the murders. Michelle even said she had been awake at 1 a.m. and heard nothing. William DeRuse had never been investigated as a suspect or even a person of interest. His wife, Michelle, had alibied him at the time, and that was that. But now, investigative focus shifted to him as the primary suspect. Now that they had DeRuse's name, the modern investigators were eager to tie him to Rita's murder with something a little more incriminating than a cigarette butt. After all, pretty much everyone in 1971 smoked. And with DeRuse living in the same building, DNA on a butt was felt to be insufficient to conclusively connect him to the crime. They wanted something with his touch DNA on it that was inseparable from the commission of the murder. The original investigators had collected and preserved a lot of evidence, considering they had literally no concept of what most of it, like the butt and the buttons on the housecoat, could ever be used for. Everything was well documented and items were preserved, even though their evidentiary value wasn't certain. Here's what they still had that was considered ripe for DNA testing. 2 blue cloth drawstrings from Rita's housecoat, a piece of linoleum with blood smears on it, Rita's underwear, part of Rita's nightgown, Rita's housecoat, and a piece of wood. These items were hand-delivered to DNA Labs International by Detective Corporal Tom Tremblay on March 24, 2022. This was the same lab that had used the cigarette butt DNA extract to conduct direct and kinship testing to rule out the 13 prime suspects. They also provided the lab with a DNA sample from Rita Curran. I was very surprised to hear that a sample from Rita's autopsy remained in evidence and was still viable and yielded her DNA sample. DNA Labs International used the AbJack machine to test some of these items which Rita's killer was suspected to have touched and compare any male DNA found to the male DNA on the cigarette butt, believed to belong to the suspect. On August 24, 2022, DNA Labs International's report concluded that the blood on the linoleum and the piece of wood was Rita's, not the suspect's. But they found a DNA mixture on the underwear, and the suspect could not be excluded as a contributor to the foreign DNA profile. The analysis concluded that it was approximately 61 times more probable if the sample originated from Rita Curran and the unknown suspect whose DNA was on the cigarette than it have originated from Rita Curran and an unknown person. This was considered what's called limited support of the proposition that DeRuse's cells were on the underwear. Then there was the housecoat. A sample was collected of blood-free material from the left and right lapels where the housecoat opened and closed. This was the area they knew Rita's killer would have touched when ripping it open, which they knew happened during the assault. DNA analysis on Rita's polka dot housecoat indicated a DNA mixture of at least 4 individuals, with just one being a male. They compared that to the known DNA of Rita and the DNA on the cigarette butt. They concluded it was 65,000 times more likely that the mixture contained Rita's and the unknown suspect's DNA as opposed to Rita's and 3 strangers. This statistic provided strong support that the DNA from the man who left the cigarette butt was also on her housecoat. They also tested an area of the inside of the housecoat found under Rita's buttocks. The DNA profile obtained from this sample was a mixture of at least 4 individuals, one of whom was assumed to be Rita, with at least one male contributor. The DNA profile obtained from this sample was approximately 780 times more probable if the sample originated from Rita Curran, the unknown suspect, and 2 unknown persons than if it originated from Rita Curran and 3 unknown persons. so this was considered moderate support for the proposition that the DNA of the unknown suspect was on the housecoat. Well, that was a lot, but the upshot? They had DeRuse's DNA on the housecoat in 2 places, and the underwear, as well as the cigarette butt. So it was time to test William DeRuse's DNA, but of course he was dead. With a 50-year-old crime, it was almost too much to hope for that he would still be alive. Worse, the investigators learned from the medical examiner's office in San Francisco that DeRuse had been cremated, and they had not retained any biological evidence that could be subjected to DNA testing. They were going to have to turn to the next best thing. Detective Chanette located a living half-brother of William DeRuse named Douglas M., named in Parabon's report as a potential source of DNA for kinship analysis to help identify DeRuse, as they would share about 25% of their DNA as half-siblings. Douglas was elderly, was in a long-term care facility, and was nonverbal. But luckily, Detective Chanette was able to establish contact with Douglas's adult children. As their father's legal guardian, they were legally empowered to grant permission for Chilton County, Alabama law enforcement officers working with Detective Chanette to collect buccal swabs from Douglas. The swabs were collected and sent to Vermont. Detective Chanette entered them into evidence on September 2nd, 2022. This is from the report. Quote, Douglas's DNA was sent to DNA Labs International for direct comparison to the DNA profile from the Lark cigarette butt to see if that DNA reflected that its contributor was in fact the half-brother of Douglas, which is William DeRuse. We later received the results from DNA Labs International, and additional testing indicated that the relative probability that Douglas M. is related to unknown number 1 as a half-sibling is 97.03% in the general population. These results support the conclusion that Douglas M. and unknown number 1 are half-siblings. The Burlington team finally had what they needed to declare that William DeRuse, who had definitively left his DNA on Rita's housecoat, underwear, and the cigarette butt, was the killer they had been seeking for 50-plus years. Now it was time to dig up all the intel they could on William DeRuse, definitively named as the man who attacked, brutalized, and killed his downstairs neighbor, Rita Curran, in her bedroom in a 70-minute window of time. Remember that Detective Chanette had interviewed Michelle DeRuse by phone way back in December 2021. Well, now Detective Tremblay and Detective Chanette contacted Michelle again and updated her on the situation. On September 27th, they flew out to Eugene, Oregon, and interviewed Michelle for 3 hours at the police station. Michelle was now using a different name, but I'm going to call her Michelle for simplicity's sake. Michelle said she grew up in Woodstock, New York, but her family had moved to Burlington in 1965 or 1966 when her dad took a job with IBM. After high school there, she graduated from Hunter College in New York with a nursing degree. In 1970, she was working in San Francisco as a nurse when she met William Richard DeRuse at a Zen center. He was 7 years her senior, tall, charismatic, and missing part of his left pinky. They began dating as both were into what she called the Buddhist scene, and then they moved in together. DeRuse did not drink or do drugs. He was committed to the ascetic Buddhist lifestyle. Michelle said she never met DeRuse's family, but he told her some things. He said he had 6 brothers, and he talked about his mother, but he never mentioned his father. He also told her he'd been to prison in California twice, serving 2 to 3 years in Folsom for armed robbery. He'd been married before to a woman from South America Michelle never met. It's unclear what DeRuse did for money. Michelle could not really recall him working when they were in California. Then Michelle broke up with DeRuse and moved cross-country back to Burlington. There wasn't a precipitating incident, and she couldn't recall why she'd ended the relationship. But she was living at her parents' house on South Willard Street during the spring of 1971 when DeRuse showed up unannounced. She introduced him to her parents, and they were, quote, not thrilled. But her parents were in the process of moving to British Columbia, so sometime that spring, she and DeRuse moved into the apartment at 15 Brooks Avenue, in the same large house Rita would move into in early July. It was a small unit, essentially a studio. The two married on July 5th in Burlington. Michelle said that DeRuse wanted to be the breadwinner. He was working nights as a dishwasher, but he said he was planning on opening a barbershop. He wanted her to focus on getting pregnant and having his kids. To drive home this point, he took her diaphragm and nailed it to the wall so she couldn't use it. Detectives specifically asked Michelle if she and DeRuse interacted at all with the neighbors in the building. She said they didn't. They had their own entrance to their third-floor unit. There was really no common areas shared with the other apartments other than the driveway, but they didn't have a car. She reiterated that she couldn't recall ever having a conversation with anyone else in the apartment house on Brooks Avenue, let alone go into any of the other apartments. Michelle mused aloud, "We had no relations with these people. Why would he do that? Never asked for a cup of sugar, nothing." When shown, she did not recognize Rita Curran from her photo, but remarked that she was beautiful. Then they asked her about the night of the murder. In her first interview, almost a year earlier, before they knew her husband had killed Rita, Michelle had confirmed to Detective Chenette her original statements from the day after the homicide, saying her husband was home all night and she didn't hear or see anything suspicious. She said she and DeRuse had been married for a short time, neither of them worked, and they spent all their time together. Now, she said, she remembered the murder vividly because the police were all over the place the next day. She said that on the night of Monday, July 19th, 1971, she and DeRuse were home alone, and they got into an argument. She could not remember what this argument was about at all, but she did remember that her husband said he was going for a cool-down walk and he left the apartment. She didn't remember how long he was gone, and she went to bed. She did remember that he came home and slept in the same bed as her that night. No, she didn't recall whether they had sex. Michelle had no recollection of any injuries to his person or anything like that. She didn't see any blood at all. And of course, all these years later, she couldn't remember what he was wearing that night. She said she wouldn't know if he'd disposed of any clothing. She didn't think they had a washer dryer, but she couldn't remember where they did their laundry. In the morning, the police banged on their door very early. Remember, they started the building canvass at 7 a.m. DeRuse stayed in bed, and she answered the door. The officers told Michelle that someone had, quote, been hurt pretty bad, and asked if she'd seen or heard anything. She said she hadn't. Specifically, this is what happened to remind you of the statements in Officer Garrow's 1971 report. I checked 17 Brooks Avenue, the second floor, and could not raise anyone there. On the third floor, I talked to William DeRoss, age 31, and Michelle DeRoss, age 24. They both stated they had heard nothing, and Mrs. DeRoss stated she had been up around 1 a.m. but had heard no unusual noises or anything else. Michelle now said that at the time, her husband, having gone for a walk in the night, was so inconsequential that it hadn't even occurred to her to mention it to the police. But she admitted that after the police left in that first canvass contact and she closed the door, her husband told her not to mention that he'd gone out for a walk the night before. He said he was concerned because he had a criminal record, that they would jump to conclusions and try to pin the crime on him. Some more from the original police canvass reports. Detective Winterbottom proceeded to the third-floor apartment and made contact with Mrs. Mitchell DeRoof, who stated she did not hear a thing. She told Detective Winterbottom that she did not know anything was going on until she saw the police cars and the ambulance. State Police Corporal Bruce LaHue at the third-floor apartment. Trooper LaHue identified two tenants, Mr. and Mrs. William DeRuse. His report stated the following: talked with Michelle DeRuse, wife of William. Mrs. DeRuse stated she heard and saw nothing, and as far as she knew, neither did her husband, on the night of Monday, July 19th, 1971. So Michelle told 3 different investigating officers that her husband was home with her that night. She did not mention the argument, or the walk, or the fact that he was gone for a while. Every time the police asked her if her husband was home with her that night, and as you heard, there were several occasions, she said yes. She told a different story 5 decades later to cold case detectives. 5 decades later, she gave our detectives a different story, the truth, Police Chief John Murad later said. In her 2022 interview, Michelle admitted to the investigators that the thought briefly crossed her mind that DeRuse could have committed the murder, but she said it was inconceivable because he would have had no reason to do it. Michelle admitted that she'd never directly asked DeRuse if he'd done it. She also admitted that while she couldn't recall the details of what she had told the police back then, she probably would have covered for DeRuse based on their previous conversation about his criminal record being a motive for police to accuse him. Michelle said that if she really thought DeRuse was involved in what happened to Rita, she would have quietly gone to the police. I think that's doubtful, but the detectives came away from the interview believing that Michelle had not deliberately misled the 1971 investigators. She'd been young and naive and genuinely did not believe her brand new husband had killed Rita Curran. After all, as she said, what was the motive? And how realistic was it that he went out for a walk, violently sexually assaulted and murdered someone, and came home and slipped back into bed, his wife none the wiser? How could he act totally normal in the morning and had no signs of blood or scratches or remorse? It was all very implausible, and it's easy to see how Michelle didn't entertain the idea for more than a moment. It's easy to see how she believed him when he explained that his record might attract undue attention from law enforcement. She also pointed out that as a black female in 1971, she had an inherent distrust of the police, and she totally accepted as normal her husband asking her to omit the details of his absence for fear of provoking undue scrutiny of him because of his record as a felon. Michelle did answer one important question the detectives posed to her, whether her husband smoked. The answer was yes, although she couldn't recall any specific brand and the name Lark did not seem to ring a bell. Michelle and DeRuse's life in Burlington did not last long after Rita's murder. She wasn't sure of the exact date that this happened, but DeRuse suddenly moved to Thailand that fall. They remained married, and Michelle couldn't remember why she didn't go to Thailand too, but suspected it was because they couldn't both afford plane tickets. She stayed in Burlington and worked as a nurse, and when she saved enough money, she went to Thailand and met him there in March of 1972. When she got there, DeRuse had achieved monkhood. The two traveled around Thailand for a short time and then returned to the Thonburi Monastery in a Bangkok suburb. There, DeRuse was a monk and she became a nun. She said they never had much of a relationship after that because it was against their religious principles. She ended up staying in Thailand for about a year and a half. DeRuse left the country before she did. She couldn't remember where he went, but he had asked her for money to help him pay for a trip that did not include her, and she refused. She said that was the last time she saw him or had any communication with him whatsoever. Much later, back in the U.S., she went ahead and got a legal divorce through an attorney. Michelle was clearly emotionally impacted by the realization that her new husband had gone downstairs and brutally murdered a woman in a time when she naively thought he was out getting some fresh air. Michelle's father knew Rita's family from living in Burlington. This crime was close to home, but it was way closer to home than she had ever suspected. Very oddly, there was another mention of William DeRuse in the case file. Lieutenant Trieb found his name in a report of a tip written down by detectives Davis and Godin. It reads, quote, Wednesday, July 28, 1971, 0900 hours. William DeRuse, age 31, 15 Brooks Avenue, Burlington, DOB 121439. Above subject's name was brought to our attention by an informer who stated that the subject was capable of committing a violent crime. Subject informed us that he was home at the time of the crime with his wife, but that they did not see or hear anything. Informed us that he is a farm laborer on the Palmer Farm in Heinsberg. Okay, what? A tip was called in 1 week after the murder, naming DeRuse as someone who could have killed Rita. The tipster knew that DeRuse and Michelle had been home on the night of the murder, but had witnessed nothing, or so they said. That was it. There was nothing else in the case file explaining whether this tip was ever investigated. Detectives Davis and Godin had both passed away by this time, and it's unlikely that they would ever remember this anyway. Hundreds of tips were called in, after police pleaded for information in Rita's case. This one may have gotten buried under the mountain of them. Detective Chenette asked Michelle about this, and she had no idea who could have tipped about DeRuse, but she said he had never worked on a farm, and they didn't have a car, so he would have had no way of getting there. To this day, that's all we know about this tip. But someone knew what William DeRuse was capable of, knew his date of birth, and knew his alibi. Detectives moved on to interview another woman who had been married to William DeRuse. On September 29, 2022, detectives Chenette and Tremblay interviewed Sarah H. in Colorado. Sarah met DeRuse in San Francisco in July of 1974. She said she was living a hippie lifestyle and had hitchhiked to San Francisco from Boulder. SCO buffs. She and DeRuse met at a Zen flat, which I think is some sort of communal living center. She knew him as a guru named Dutch. From the report, quote, Sarah further described DeRuse as a guru in that he was a very influential speaker. She advised that he had a power over people, mental hypnosis almost. She described herself as a lost hippie who was under his influence, end quote. DeRuse expressed interest in her, and they had lots of interests in common, such as meditating and bicycling. He didn't tell her a lot about his time in Thailand, and he never mentioned Vermont. She knew he had been married and lived in Thailand, but he did not talk much about these periods in his life. Sarah and DeRuse tied the knot on November 19, 1974, after meeting just 4 months earlier. Sarah described DeRuse as 6 feet tall, slender, with dark hair. She said he was mild-mannered, but there were 2 jarring incidents that stood out because they seemed so at odds with everything DeRuse purported to stand for. In one incident, they were having drinks with a female friend named Ophelia. They were chatting away one moment, and the next, DeRuse pulled out a pocket knife and stabbed Ophelia in the abdomen. This was completely unprovoked and out of the blue. There was no argument or disagreement going on in any way. Ophelia went to the hospital and reported the incident, and DeRoos was arrested. This from Detective Tremblay's report, quote, Sarah advised that DeRoos returned to their apartment the next day and acted as if nothing had happened. She stated that DeRoos inquired if he had stabbed her, Sarah, and she informed him that he had stabbed Ophelia. She said that DeRoos then went about his business, they never discussed the incident any further, and that he didn't seem to show any remorse for what happened. In the next incident Sarah related, DeRoos actually did try to harm her. The two of them were drinking, but again, there was no precipitating argument. In fact, Sarah said DeRoos would often go off on angry tangential rants, and she never engaged with him. She told the detectives that she felt very insecure in the relationship and didn't really stand up for herself. So anyway, suddenly DeRoos just started strangling her, using his hands on her throat to choke her nearly to the point where she lost consciousness. I imagine that with this statement, the detectives side-eyed each other. William DeRoos had strangled Rita. Sarah was lucky to be alive. So it sounds like at this point in the mid-70s, DeRoos was starting to unravel. Sarah said that he purchased a hunting rifle during a camping trip that might have happened in about 1976 in the Sacramento area. For the record, aspirational Buddhists don't usually carry rifles or hunt. Sarah stated that she believed DeRoos was arrested by the feds for this purchase, and he disappeared for 5 to 7 days, during which she assumed he was in jail. Once again, DeRoos did not discuss this incident after returning home, and she didn't press it. Finally, Sarah reported that DeRoos also used cocaine occasionally, and she didn't know what else he was doing, but she knew for a fact that he drank heavily and took Thorazine, used to treat bipolar disorder. Sarah and DeRoos took their marriage on the road, traveling California in a Plymouth Duster and bouncing from place to place. They lived off welfare money. In 1978, they settled at the Triangle Motel in Eureka, California for 6 months, and that summer, Sarah caught DeRoos in bed with another woman. At that point, she left him. A couple of months later, when Sarah had moved on to another relationship, DeRoos showed up at the house she shared with her new man. Sarah was uncomfortable with this because she had no idea how he had found her and he was acting weird. He left after about 24 hours and she never saw him again. Finally, the investigators reached out to Rita's living former roommates Paul Robinson and Carrie D. As I mentioned earlier, Beverly Lamfer had passed away by this time. They asked both roommates whether they remembered any interactions with William DeRoos or his wife Michelle. Shown photos of Michelle and DeRoos, Carrie did not remember either one of them. She said she lived in the apartment for only 2 months before Rita moved in, and she moved out immediately upon Rita's murder. She did not have any recollection of William DeRoos living in the very same apartment house as her, Paul, Beverly, and Rita. As for Paul, he thought the photo of DeRoos looked like someone he might have seen in passing, but that was it. He didn't spend a lot of time at the apartment, he didn't live there long, and he didn't interact with the neighbors. Neither Carrie nor Paul had any recollection of the couple other than in passing, and they confirmed that neither William nor Michelle had been in their apartment, says the report. Okay, just a few more biographical facts about William Richard DeRoos, one of the stranger murderers I've covered. He was born on December 14, 1939, the son of William Henry DeRoos of South Dakota and Lois Lyle Orr. The father, William Henry, served in the U.S. Navy and was stationed in Japan, Texas, and Florida. Detective Chenette told me that his research revealed that DeRoos' father had a family in every port. That is, he had at least 3 different sets of kids with 3 wives, and some of them at the same time, but in different locations. Remember, William said that he had 6 brothers, but we know he was the only child from his parents' union. His dad got around. We know next to nothing about DeRoos' earlier life, other than what his ex-wives told the investigators, which may or may not be true. There is mention of him completing military training at Fort Knox, Kentucky at age 17, but military service has not been confirmed, and neither Michelle or Sarah knew about this. Detective Chenette tried hard to dig up a criminal history for DeRoos, having heard from Michelle and Sarah about him doing time for armed robbery in San Francisco, being arrested for an illegal gun purchase, and so on. But he was never able to find any records. The authorities in the San Francisco area informed him that their records from that era had all been destroyed long ago, so that wasn't helpful. And various states in which DeRoos was known to spend time had nothing on him. In early March of 2022, Detective Chenette spoke on the phone with a sister-in-law of DeRoos's, who described the extended family as very fragmented and estranged. She remembered William DeRoos as someone who was not close with the family. She recalled meeting him only once in the early 80s when he showed up in Florida for an unexpected visit to his father, William Henry DeRoos. The sister-in-law described DeRoos as odd, dressing in traditional Taiwanese attire and having a Thai woman and 2 children with him who did not speak English. It wasn't clear whether the children were his, and the whole thing was bizarre and awkward. After that last family interaction, DeRoos wasn't around too long. On August 7, 1986, he was found dead in an apartment building in San Francisco, slumped over on the floor with a handkerchief tourniquet on his upper left arm and a needle and drugs next to him. His cause of death was acute morphine poisoning, an overdose. He was 46. I would guess that he possibly overdosed on purpose, except a friend was found with him, also dead of an overdose. As an aside, drugs are another thing that Buddhist monks aren't big on, and of course murder is contrary to literally everything they stand for. The Burlington police held a press conference on February 21, 2023, announcing that the BPD's Detective Service Bureau is unanimously certain that the sole perpetrator responsible for the aggravated murder of Rita Patricia Curran on July 19th or 20th in 1971 was William DeRoos. Not only did they have DNA evidence, they had circumstantial evidence. He lived in the building, but Rita did not know him, and there was no valid reason for him to be in her bedroom. He had no alibi and was unaccounted for during the time of the murder. He was a smoker and smoked indoors, according to Michelle. After the murder, he told his wife to lie on his behalf. His life plan changed drastically after the murder, and he moved to Thailand. He continued to demonstrate a propensity for random violence throughout his life. Chief John Murad told the assembled crowd that Chittenden County State's Attorney Sarah George had reviewed the report with all this information and agreed that they would have probable cause to arrest William DeRoos were he alive. Much of the press conference was a remembrance of Rita. She was a teacher and a singer and a giver, and she was loved, said Chief Murad. And the random violence of her murder left a stain on our community. It devastated her family, and for 50 years they have waited for justice. Rita Curran's brother Tom came up to the lectern and told the media that the previous week, the family was honored to attend a luncheon with about 60 members of law enforcement who had worked his sister's case over the decades. He could not thank them enough for never backing down in their relentless pursuit of Rita's killer. The family had engraved Rita's headstone with a short poem by E.B. Browning that Rita had selected to accompany her yearbook photo in school. It reads, "I seek no copy now of life's first half. Leave here the pages, with long missing curled, and write me new my future's epigraph, new angel mine, unhoped for in the world." Tom told those at the press conference of the impact of Rita's murder on the family. He said, "Life was different in those days. My mother came here from Ireland, and my father was from Newfoundland. We were an old-fashioned, strong Catholic family. I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents and what they went through. I pray to my parents, and I pray to Rita." Of his and Rita's parents, Tom and Mary Curran, Tom said they didn't have counseling or help in their time of grief, just rosary beads and prayers. Tom also extended his thanks to Season of Justice, which paid for the testing that led to the resolution of Rita's case. He announced that the family was creating a GoFundMe to refund Season of Justice for the grant that benefited Rita, so that they could pay it forward to help other families find resolution to their loved ones' cases. Rita's sister, Mary Campbell, spoke next. She said the family has preserved Rita as part of their legacy, making an effort to remember her over the decades. She thanked the investigators for their kindness, caring, and compassion over the years. Burlington Mayor Miro Weinberger spoke, saying that Rita's murder was a terrible night for our community that caused pain to the family for 50 years. He said, while it was tragic that William DeRoos was dead, so there will never be accountability, he hopes that at least the family has received some measure of closure. He pointed out, quote, "We are only here because of generations of investigators and the integrity of the investigation in the first critical hours." Chief Murad took a moment to address the crucial role of open-source DNA databases. He said that the people opting in, the genetic witnesses, people like you and me, are the real heroes. He said their willingness to share their DNA brings evildoers to justice and finds justice for families. Several of the investigators who worked the case also spoke, Detective Lieutenant Jim Trebe, who cited a close relationship with the Curran family and thanked his team. Lead Detective Tom Chanette and former Lead Detective Tom Tremblay thanked the parties involved and referenced their undying commitment to the family to solve Rita's case. The website Vermont Digger interviewed Patrick Leahy, the Chittenden County State's Attorney at the time of Rita's death, who went on to become a U.S. Senator. He said while he always hoped Rita's murder would be solved, quote, "I must admit after 20 and 30, 40 years, I figured it never would." End quote. But as C.C. Moore, who spoke via video at the press conference, said, quote, "This case is a fantastic illustration of the power of investigative genetic genealogy to narrow down the pool of suspects to just one person. This case was over 50 years old, and it only took me a few hours to narrow it down to William DeRoos." Okay, so William DeRuse murdered Rita Curran, it's a fact. But how did he do it? The slaying over the years took on almost mythic proportions in Burlington, with theories about Bundy, a cover-up, conspiracies. And all the while, it seems, it was simple. Very late on the night of July 19th, 1971, Rita's upstairs neighbor, DeRuse, angry after an argument with his new wife, stormed out of their third-floor apartment and went down the exterior stairs. Reaching the ground floor, he perhaps noted that the cars belonging to Carrie and Beverly were gone, but Rita's was there. The ground floor apartment was quiet. DeRuse went around to the back of the building to the small backyard where he was accustomed to stand and smoke. He stood there smoking and perhaps even peered into Rita's window and saw her there asleep. The back door to the porch was unlocked, as was the door to the storage area and the door to the kitchen. He tiptoed inside and found in the closest bedroom a peacefully sleeping Rita, in her housecoat and curlers. In a rage, DeRuse took out on Rita the urges he had after arguing with Michelle. When Carrie and Paul came home, DeRuse escaped out the kitchen door, his fists leaving Rita's blood there. He went back upstairs, stripped off his clothes, and got in bed with Michelle. Speaking of Michelle, at the press conference, the authorities said they will not charge her. Lying to the police is not a crime. But, as they pointed out, it's not helpful. Police say they have cause to believe DeRuse continued to hurt people and was a dangerous person, although they have no proof that he killed anyone else. I personally think it's likely that he did. His DNA is now in CODIS, so as agencies rerun their old evidence from the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, perhaps he will be connected by DNA to additional crimes. After 52 years, Rita Curran's case is closed thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. Thank you so much to C.C. Moore and Detective Corporal Thomas Chenette for speaking with me about this case. Thank you as well to BPD PIO Lieutenant Mai Nguyen for his diligence in working with me to get this story out there. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to DNAIDpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.